Welcome to Rooted to Thrive, conversations to elevate our humanity. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson Ansari, Professor P for short. This is your podcast sanctuary for cultivating mindsets and skills to elevate our shared humanity. We're taking a deep dive into practical strategies to evolve as anti-racist, culturally competent, and inclusive individuals and leaders. In each episode, we're bringing you real-world examples and actionable takeaways. We're going to talk about personal growth, fostering connection, and creating positive change that dismantles systemic barriers and creates environments where all of us are valued, empowered, and activate our collective power. This is Rooted to Thrive. Welcome and welcome back to everyone joining us on Rooted to Thrive, Conversations to Elevate Our Humanity podcast. I'm your host, Rochelle Peterson Ansari, aka Professor P. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Jacqueline Powell, who is just a wonderful human, whose favorite role in life is being mom to a smart, beautiful teenage son and two toy poodles, Pepper and Cinnamon. And I feel that I am at least the mom to a Shih Tzu poodle. She teaches physiology, and we'll get more into what that is, and is the Vice Chair of Physiology for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, she writes, researches, and works on the ground for health equity and health justice, helping medical students to become equity-minded and the inclusive medical practitioners that we all need. Now, the personal part I have to share with you is that we met at a virtual cafe style meeting on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it was hosted by a medical science association. So Jacqueline, I am honored to have you joining me today to just share a few of the ways you have elevated your humanity and helped others do the same. How are you doing today?
Oh, good. Thank you so much, Rochelle, for having me on your show today. I am so thrilled and honored to be a guest to talk to you today. I don't even know where to begin on this, but I'll start with my journey in the realm of physiology. And for those of you who don't know, physiology is literally how the body works. And I actually fell into health justice and health equity work just by happenstance in my teaching. So I've been teaching physiology for the past 20 years. And my area of expertise is renal physiology. So that's the kidneys, so how the kidneys work in normal functioning. One of the things that I was teaching my students was about the equations, calculating the GFR, which is the glomerular filtration rate, which denotes how well the kidney functions.
Okay.
And this number is the number that clinicians will look at to determine if the patient is healthy, if they need a transplant, if they need to be on dialysis. And you might find yourself in a situation where you don't have any internet. What happens if you're in an earthquake, in a country that's just had an earthquake or had a tornado or a hurricane or has been through a natural disaster, and you cannot get on your phone to download the app that will help you determine this? You need to know how to do this and calculate their renal function from their lab values. But I also like to give the students the why. I noted that there were two formulas because they used race as a parameter. And there was one particular formula for African-American Black patients and another formula for everybody else. And so as I was looking at this, I was like, this is interesting. And I went back and I even looked at my own lab values. And sure enough, I had two different lab values. And what was interesting was the African American, the Black value was much higher than if I was white or Latina or, Asian. And that to me was an interesting factor, because that told me, having a background in knowing what the GFR meant and how to calculate it, that with that higher value being a Black patient, I would have to have an increased amount of disease to receive the same type of treatment than if I was a white patient.
Oh, or Latino or any
Or
other.
Latina, or if I was Asian or white, right? And so that actually started me down this rabbit hole of, but why? Where did this come from?
Mhm.
And, as I did the digging, I found that this was actually a slave era. This was created during the slave era.
Wow.
So essentially, how this began was there was this belief that Black people had more creatinine, more muscle mass. And because of this, they had to account for this increased amount of creatinine in this calculation. And when you look at the study that was made, they looked at 200 Black folk as compared to 1,500 white folk, and then made this epiphany and created this equation. And so basically they were saying, oh, well, Black people have larger muscle mass, they've got more creatinine. And this again was a rationalization for being able to work the enslaved Africans, because they were stronger, they had more muscle mass, and they were able to be labored and be used in the fields and in the homes a lot more readily.
Mm.
If you were to compare me to, let's say, China of the WWE, I do not have more muscle mass than she does, right?
Right, right.
So you can't look at that and use that as a parameter for a clinical guideline or a diagnostic. And so as I started introducing this into my classroom, I was like, this is what they're telling you to use in the hospitals, but this is how it was derived.
Mm.
And this is what it's showing. So now if I came to you with this number, you would probably look at it and say, oh, she's normal. But if I was white or Latina or I was Asian and I came to you with the same lab values, but the calculation of that number was derived differently and it was a lower number, you might say, oh, you have a disease here. We've got to keep a closer eye on you. And so I started to again do some more research and found out that, again, with Black folks usually having a different or a higher number in a lot of cases than a white person have. And so that would require them to have more of the disease than a white person or an Asian person or a Hispanic person. What
Mhm.
was interesting to find was that if these calculations had been normalized across all ethnicities and races, 33% of Black people would have been diagnosed with a disease
Earlier, or
much earlier, and would have been able to have had their transplant or been on dialysis, and or would have been able to have received the care that they've needed to be healthy.
mm.
And so that disparity kind of started that slippery slope of, oh, well, we've got this race-based clinical guideline in kidney function, which I have to say has been thankfully eradicated.
Oh,
The
wonderful.
Kidney Association, the Association for Kidney Kidney and the American Kidney Association went through and looked at this and saw this health disparity, and as of 2021 have revised that clinical equation to remove race as a parameter.
Wow.
So they've tried to equal the playing field when it comes to determining kidney function in healthcare and that disparity.
Mhm.
But again, we've got age, we've got gender that are also included. And that's a whole nother conversation, because what if I'm non-binary? How
Mm.
does that play in that function? So their clinical guidelines and the diagnostic algorithms that we see really do have flaws that we have to be mindful of. And even though these are what are being used in the hospital, I always tell my students, be mindful of these clinical guidelines. This is what they're telling you to use, but be aware that they are race-based and not race-conscious. And so, and I, again, went down that slippery slope and found so many other things that have led to health disparities, you know, within our medical system and for particularly our Black and Brown populations. And so that has started me on that path to health equity and health justice, and what can we do to at least educate.
That's right. I'm thinking just personally, like how many people we have lost to kidney disease,
Yeah.
right? Like how many, and not necessarily, maybe in my extended family, my neighbors, right? Just so many people on dialysis. And it could very well be because they were misdiagnosed or not diagnosed early enough because of an equation created during slavery.
Yeah.
That is powerful. Like, I don't even, we could just talk about that for the whole
Yeah.
podcast. You just
Yeah.
blew my mind.
Yeah. And again, the study that they created was so imbalanced. How
Mhm.
are you going to look at a population of 200 Black folk and then 1,500 white
1,500.
people, and then be able to make an adequate comparison and create and derive a formula that is going to be used to ascertain somebody's kidney function, and that has continued to be used for decades and centuries? That
Century.
just doesn't make sense to me.
That's right.
In 2016, there was a professor, Kelly Hoffman et al. They wrote a paper. And this is one that I always reference and always, you know, ask people, if you have a minute, take a look at it because it's very interesting. And this study looked at two populations of white people and asked them specific questions. The first group were just white people who were not involved in the medical field. And the second group were white students in their first year, second year, third year, and residency. So that meant that they had gone through their 4 years of medical school and had now graduated and were in the clinics. And some of the questions that they asked, and one in particularly that scored pretty high was, you know, do Black people have a higher threshold of pain? So are they less sensitive to pain? Do Black people not feel pain as readily as white people? And 25% of residents believed that Black people do not feel pain like white people do. And so a lot of the times we'll hear these things, right? Oh, this is what they're saying. Black people don't feel pain like white people. Really? But why?
Right.
And that's the key question. We got to dig in and see what are the social determinants of health, what are the factors, what's playing a role in these statements. When you dig deeply into that, again, this is derived from slave era, right? And, you know, you go into the hospitals and Black and brown people are less likely to receive opioids as opposed to white patients for their pain. Wanda Sykes, the comedian, she has a special, and one of her bits is called White People Get the Opioids. And she talks about her experience having a double mastectomy, and they sent her home with ibuprofen. And
Really?
yes. And if you have the opportunity to watch that, the clip is called White People Get the Opioids by Wanda Sykes. It's 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. And I share that with my class when I am doing my pain and social justice. And it really quiets them because, you know, she's a celebrity, right? She's wealthy, she's got money, she's got status, and yet she still can't go into a hospital, have both breasts removed, and be given adequate pain medication, opioids. She's given ibuprofen.
Mm.
Yeah. And
Mm.
so it really, really, it doesn't matter who you are or, you know, what you do. How we have to start educating people. Race is a social construct. Race is not a biological construct, right?
That's right.
Race is not an epidemiological determinant for disease. You have to start looking at it, because I can tell you, Rochelle,
Mhm.
Black and brown kids, Latino, you know, Hispanic kids and Black kids have a higher incidence of asthma. But I could leave it right there.
Right.
But the question is why?
Mhm.
Look at, where do these Black and brown kids live? What type of housing do they have? What type of air quality do they have? Are they located next to a plant? Do they have adequate housing that has, you know, that has adequate air quality? Are we looking at government housing where, are there animals that are there that's causing allergies? What does their environment look at? And then you have to start now talking to your patients and asking these questions and saying, where are you living? How is your environment?
Yes.
Are you able to get
Mhm.
healthy foods? Are
Right.
you able to, do you have clean water? Like if you look at Cancer Alley, there's
Right.
a large amount of Black and brown people who are facing cancer because of where they live next to a toxic waste plant that is
Yes.
creating their cancer. So social determinants of health, finding out where people are in their livelihood,
Yeah.
asking those questions, right? And
Critical.
listening
Mhm.
is key
Yes.
to eliminating these health disparities. You have
Yes.
a patient who comes and you ask them, are you taking your meds? No, I'm not taking my meds.
Mhm.
Now, most physicians would be like, this is a difficult patient, they're non-compliant. But the question is why? That's a key. Why? Does
Mhm.
this patient have the ability to get to the pharmacy to get their medication? Is their closest pharmacy 10 miles away?
Right.
Do they
Right.
have the ability to go to the pharmacy? Do they have a car? Do they have to take a bus? Can they get off work and meet the pharmacy before it closes?
Yeah.
Do they have electricity? Can they keep the medication refrigerated? So these are questions that you have to start asking your patients,
And I wanted to chime in there because
Mhm.
you could have all of those things and still not take the medication. So I was diagnosed with a chronic illness in 2020. It's diabetes. And, we were sedentary during that time. And I do have, family members who were diabetic, like my grandparents or my paternal grandparents. And so we were always watching my A1C. To me, I wasn't doing anything different. I, I always was in the pre-diabetic range. And then 2020 comes, we're sedentary. And I did have a moment with like wanting to go to comfort foods. I admit it, it was weird. But bottom
We
line,
all do then.
right. Like, so my A1C, shoots up. I have to say, with a lot of great education and just diet and exercise, I took my numbers down.
And as we speak to, some of the root causes of diabetes, you'll see that obesity will play a role in the creation of diabetes. And then when you look at some of these Black areas predominant where Black people predominantly live, they have food deserts, right? The closest grocery store, Trader Joe's or whatever, where you can get fresh fruits and vegetables is
Yes.
miles and miles away. But on every corner, there's a Popeye's chicken or a McDonald's,
Yes.
and you've got a dollar meal. And so you have to be aware of, well, how is this being created? How is this being caused? If we had more, fruits and vegetables and grocery stores and health food stores, would we see these incidences be reduced? And yes, you made that conscious choice of making that lifestyle change,
Mhm.
because you're not wrong. A lot of the times when you listen to these medication commercials and side effects are
Right, right.
and you're just like, is it worth it? In some cases there it's needed, and in some cases a simple lifestyle change can do
Yes.
much more than the medication would. But you did speak to medical mistrust, and that is a big
Yes.
thing in the Black community. I
Mhm.
mean, when you go back to the Tuskegee syphilis,
Yes.
study,
Mhm.
and you look at Henrietta Lacks, they're still using her cells to this day, and her family has barely been, if not at all, been compensated the way that they need to be. And this was without her consent. Tuskegee
Right.
occurred without informed consent, you
Mhm.
know. But I do have to say, though, that the medical mistrust is very real.
Yes.
And very, very, it's not without cause, right? There's a reason for that, and it's a very valid reason for that.
Mhm.
However, as we work through our clinical trials, we do need to start developing that trust, because we do need to have equitable trials, equitable studies. We need to have a range of ethnicities to see how these drugs can be developed to benefit everybody
Everyone. And
right now.
that's right. And I really want to stop for a second, because I
Mm-hmm.
want people to understand what you said, or what I heard, right? You saying is that these systemic issues continue, literally have killed people,
Mm-hmm.
right? They have continued over centuries.
Yeah.
And we bring them into every generation, maybe not unknowingly, right? Because we trust the science, for example, right? If we don't ask different questions, and don't miss the point that systemic oppression of all kinds, right? Race, around race, gender identity, around, you know, religion, and all kinds of areas of identity were brought forward by people. And it was the question you asked. I talked to another person involved she's in a nonprofit
Mm-hmm.
related to health. And she was talking about a survey that was done. Yeah, there was a survey done around, I believe it was around cervical cancer, or study done. And in the study, like the initial results were that, there were like African Americans had a higher incidence of cervical cancer than any other racial group. And there was someone at the table who asked, well, who are we defining as Asian, right? Who are we
Yeah.
defining as Asian? And when they disaggregated the data, right, for all of the different Asian ethnic groups,
Mm-hmm.
found that the group that had the highest incidence among all women of all races were Southeast Asian women.
And that's the point. Yes, that is an important, important point. Because when you look at Black, right? I'm not African American. I'm Black. My roots are in Jamaica. I grew up in Canada, so I'm Afro-Caribbean, but I
Mhm,
identify as Black.
mhm.
But you're also Black,
Right.
right? You've got, African folk who live in the UK that are Black.
That's right.
But our environment may allow us to have a higher incidence of a specific disease. And as you said, once you parsed out and you broke away from the racial aspect and broke it down more to the ethnicity and to the environment as to where they were originating, you
Mhm.
found that the higher incidence was more related to an area of where they lived.
Right. And when you say that right, it's racism, we're talking about the fact that people have beliefs, values, right, that are harming people, right? Like they're
Absolutely.
making decisions that affect their lives, right? Like literally their ability to live, the quality of their lives based on beliefs that can be unconscious,
Mhm.
or they're they're just going along with information that's being introduced to them, because so many of us are conditioned to just believe the science,
There
right,
you
and
go.
not going back.
Yeah.
Everything everything I hear you saying is, remember to go back. Again, we're talking about someone who has a certain level of wealth and fame.
It matters.
However, we also do have that very vicious classism, right?
We
People
do.
do not care about poor people.
They
And,
do
and, and
not.
as of the date of this recording, we're literally facing an issue where the power went out in Houston, Texas. And I have several family members there. And one child has asthma, and they have to be taken to a car to get some air, right? Throughout the day. It's been several days, right, that the power has been out. Um, but it laid on my heart that even without all of the resources in the world, my grandson, the oldest grandson, who's just turned 21, could go and help a neighbor get some water, because there's elders that don't have a car, or people who can't drive anymore. They don't have a car. There's no water where he lives as well. So I'm like, you could go in your car and get someone some bottled water. Take care of at least one person, and then tell somebody else to do the same, right? We don't care about people. And unfortunately, and listen, it didn't come to my mind. So we're all I'm not on a high horse about it, right? Like, I believe that I have to also be nudged, right? To remember in areas where I'm privileged. I thought deeply about these things during Hurricane Katrina, right? When people open up roads and tell people to go in one direction. Okay, well, people without cars, where are they? Right? And you thought everything was, going to be solved through that, and did not think about the fact that people don't have cars, you know. So I know that we all don't stay present, especially after, like, again, if we've never had the experience of lack in certain ways. And I believe it has something to do with the way our brains work, right? Like, that we wouldn't readily do that, right? But it takes intentionality
Mm-hmm.
to make different decisions, to care in ways that save lives. And that's what I'm hearing you say, right? That it takes something different. Oh, it's intentionality.
Yeah, I mean, the resources are out there, and folks need to take the time to educate themselves
Mhm.
and to understand cultural humility and cultural awareness, particularly if you are going to be serving a variety of populations, right? And you are taking care of people. Be aware of your biases. There's the Harvard implicit bias test, which surprises people all the time. That's one that's pretty readily used.
Yes.
There are documentaries, there are podcasts, there are books that can be read, there are training sessions that you can take.
Correct.
The training sessions that I was doing during COVID time was it the Diversity and Resilience Center from the El Paso, which they have a variety of training sessions.
Mhm.
It's all about educating yourself and knowing what your limitations are and trying to work through those limitations and those stereotypes and those biases. And you're not wrong, and it's not just Black and brown people. We're talking about the LGBTQ community. Um, excuse me. We're talking about, the older people. We're talking about, those in a lower socioeconomic bracket. I had an experience when I was actually in Canada. I was living in Toronto briefly at the time, and my son had a friend, and I, got to know his mother a little bit, and she was a little bit younger. She was a younger mother, but they lived in Section 8 housing. So, but to me, listen, if you're good to my kid and we can get along, then I don't really care about your situation, but I'll help you however I can. And she called me one day and she says, I need your help. And I said, absolutely. And she says, I feel like you need to come and get my child, like I'm going to harm him. So I said, I will be there like in 5 minutes. She says, I actually need you to take me to the hospital, please. I really need some help. So I took her to the hospital. And what I did was I stayed outside with the boys while she went in. And about 20 minutes, she came out and she was in tears, enraged and in tears. And I said to her, what happened? What? And like, I walked in there and I told them everything that was happening to me. And the first thing that they immediately jumped to was that I was drug seeking. And that's all that I was there for, and that none of my concerns were valid because she wanted to go. She actually was asking to go. They had this like a halfway house for those with mental issues. So like you can take a break for like a weekend, you can disassociate from whatever triggers are in your space,
Right.
take that little retreat, and then come back however long they've, prescribed you to be there. Long story short, they ended up giving her the drugs that she was asking for. And they ended up actually taking her as an inpatient into that mental health space. They gave her that weekend, and, she was able to get the care that she was asking for.
Right.
After I had to step in and advocate for her, because when they took a look at her, they saw, oh, she's, socioeconomically on the bottom rung, and she's just here for drugs, and this is the quickest way that she can get it, without actually looking at her as a whole human being, as a patient who needs help and care.
Yeah, and that's so important. You are starting to talk about how you are elevating your humanity as well as others. You use the privilege of those letters in front of your name. We had to, I know many stories like that. Many of my in my circle have those letters in front of their name and have had to use them in hospitals.
Yeah.
For that very reason, which is unfortunate, right? But thankfully, you all did take a stand for other people. You know, we need that as well to elevate our humanity. Yes, and I do want to talk to you a little bit about what you're doing in the educational space too, because well, you've talked about it, right? Teaching your students, but I was curious as well if you've had challenges or what might be some common challenges you encounter in promoting anti-racism in those spaces and how you address it. I don't
Yeah,
know, maybe one example.
absolutely. Well, one of the biggest things that I have faced is, particularly in the space of academia for me, two things really. It's lawmakers that are starting to make this an issue. Recently, there was an article put out by CNN where a lawmaker in North Carolina is proposing a bill called Educate, very funny, that would ban DEI in medical schools. And doctors say it could roll back progress towards improving Black maternal health. And his bill is called Embracing Anti-Discrimination, Unbiased Curricula, and Advancing Truth in Education, called the Educate Act. But it would amend the Higher Education Act of 1965 to prohibit medical schools from getting federal funding if they adopt policies or requirements related to DEI, including promoting beliefs that a person's sex, race, ethnicity, or skin color makes them a member of an oppressed group, or that the US is a systemically racist country. And that's an article you can find on CNN that I encourage folks to read.
Well, and before you get to that second point, I just wanted
Yeah.
to say that what you are teaching, right, is around respect. It's around not, I mean, it's upholding the oath that medical professionals take. I mean, at least the doctors do. Sure, if everybody does, but this oath, right? Like to do no harm to humans. And if anything, excuse me, to preserve life, right? And to preserve high quality of life.
Yeah.
That's the work you're doing. I don't care what you call it. Continue to do that work.
Yeah. We have to. We absolutely have to. And the other challenge that I face is that people do see the importance of it,
Mhm.
but a lot of the challenges that I'm hearing is, well, I don't know how to do it. And most of these are coming from white males in the space that, again, have had that privilege and have never had to think about, embracing DEI and including that in their teaching materials or
Right.
teaching their students in the clinics how to embrace that, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so, um, a colleague of mine and 10 of our students went ahead and co-authored a book called Best Practices for Acknowledging and Addressing Racial and Ethnic Health Disparities in Medical Education. And it literally is a how-to manual. And it answers all of those questions. Well, the book talks about the origins of, race, the racial, construct as being social, rather biological rather than social, and how that was originally derived and what it is today. We talk about various countries, the health disparities in various countries, not just the US.
Mhm.
We also talk about, okay, so now that we've acknowledged that there are health disparities, it has been derived from slave era. This isn't just a US issue. There's other countries that are facing similar crises in their healthcare system. Now, what do we do as healthcare professionals? What can you do, right? So we have a chapter that talks about, okay, let's prepare the classroom and prepare your students and embrace cultural humility, right? How do you talk about difficult subjects in your classroom? And then the next chapter talks about, okay, that's great. You've prepared the classroom now, and people are looking and are being open and receptive to this. So now how do you include diverse aspects in your teaching materials? And that involves, talking about these race-based clinical guidelines, making sure that, race and ethnicity is not specific to a specific disease, making people feel like, oh, because you're of a certain race, only a certain race of people can have a certain degree, have a certain disease.
Right.
We also want to ensure that there's representation throughout, right? And
Yes.
then the final chapter talks about, okay, now what can the medical institution and those in leadership do to ensure that all of these, building bricks are now put together to build this house of equity that we would need within the medical education space?
Phenomenal.
And so, we do get the question, well, how do I do it?
Yes.
What do I do? And I just say, well, shameless plug, here's the
Yes.
book.
Yes. Best practices for acknowledging and addressing racial and ethnic health disparities in medical education.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Phenomenal resource. This is great. I'm glad you actually worked in collaboration with so many people who brought their brilliance, right, and said, here it is for you. You have you have a handbook,
We do.
right? You
We
do
do.
not have to think that deeply to get started. Right?
And that's the thing. Just get started. It could be as simple as, adding a picture of Black skin when you're talking about dermatological conditions. It could be as simple as, ensuring that the language is correct. Because that's something else too that we're trying to also work towards is proper language,
Okay.
not having a drug addict, right?
Um,
It's not a disease. That person's not diseased. We're looking at patient first.
yes.
So it's a person who may have an opioid use disorder or an alcohol use disorder rather than an alcoholic. The
Right.
patient isn't homeless, they're unhoused, right? So
Mhm.
humanizing the person
There it is. Yeah.
and not describing them and using their disease as their descriptor, essentially.
Right. That's why I want to talk to leaders, talk to educators, talk to healthcare professionals, because we have more social power. So, before we go, I want you to give us any last, practical strategies for educators, for healthcare professionals, for leaders that they can implement to prioritize the well being of those they serve.
change is the only constant.
Mhm.
And, we can't expect to do better unless we implement that change. And, again, when I'm talking to my students about being in the hospital setting,
Listen,
listening to your patients,
yes.
hearing what they're telling you without the biases and without the assumptions, and truly advocating for what they want and need. If a patient tells you, I'm in pain, believe that they are in pain.
Yes. Thank you so much. That was phenomenal. Now, you gave us one resource. I wasn't sure if you wanted to share any other resources that you would recommend for people's further learning after the episode.
Right. So I mentioned them throughout.
Okay, good.
I
Yes.
do like the Diversity and Resilience Institute. Make sure I got that, of El Paso. That was a wonderful resource that I found very helpful. I learned so much from some of they have a variety,
Yes.
of things. I recommended that Kelly Hoffman article. The name of that one is Racial Bias in Pain Assessment and Treatment Recommendation and False Beliefs About Biological Differences Between Blacks and Whites. And of course, my book always.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Thank you. And I worked with a medical school recently, right, with their faculty. And in our work together, we were transforming bias and microaggressions into community building action, right? And in that work, we we were being very intentional about who we were being in the community, right?
Right.
Like, so who are you, right? You can educate yourself to help you with your practice, right? Or with your teaching, your educating others, your research, but also who are you being to the people in that space is so important, right? There
Absolutely.
are all of these people, these races, these ethnicities, genders, gender identities, sexual orientations, religious diversity, religious and linguistic diversity all around you. Those people
Mhm.
need you, right?
Yeah.
Need our educators to think about health, equity, and justice as well, and
And
inclusive.
I would also say we also have to be very supportive of our Black medical students, our Black and Brown medical students. We need them. There's not enough of us out there.
Mm,
And, you know, again, speaking to the medical distrust that the Black community does have, having providers that look like them will allow for a type of rapport to be built where you'll have a better understanding of my hair, of my skin, of my cultural background, without me having to. I mean, you have to explain it. I mean, not everybody's, hair, skin, and cultural background are the same, but there will be
right.
some explanation, but without having to explain it, if you understand what I mean, right? And
Yes.
so it's very important because people, will have a higher level of trust and will create a deeper rapport with providers that look more like them and
Mm,
have experienced or have had, similar personal and professional experiences and professional and personal backgrounds.
mm.
And so, going from predominantly white institutions, teaching at predominantly white institutions to teaching at HBCUs, I see the importance of supporting and graduating our Black medical students because there's so few, and our community needs them.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun. I mean, our time just flew by.
Yes, it did. And
Um,
I love to give everybody their flowers, and I'm going to give you those letters in front of your name, even though you were just so special, Jacqueline, but you are the Dr. Jacqueline M.
Thank
Powell. I
you so
want to thank you so
much.
much for being so generous with your time, your expertise. I learned a lot today, and I want sure that those listeners, people, whether they are viewing or just listening, if they want to get in touch with you or they want to find you, how
Yeah.
can they find you?
Well, I'm not really a social media gal.
That's
Um,
fine. Just
However, I am on LinkedIn under my
okay.
name,
All
Jacqueline Powell.
right.
I am on Instagram under Dr. Jax, DR period underscore JACQS, but I really have no postings. That's
Okay.
my book. So I
Okay.
mean, you won't see anything there.
That's
Uh,
that's
but you'll
awesome.
mostly find me on LinkedIn.
Okay,
I'm getting more active on LinkedIn now.
that's fine. I've had someone say, well, my information is on the university site, like that, whatever.
I'm not there
However,
yet. I'm working on that. As
right,
funnily as it sounds.
right. Wow. Yeah, so it was just really an honor to be in this space with you, with yet another champion
Yeah.
for humans, right? For another, and I know there are other people listening who are saying, well, I'm a champion for humans. And I'm challenging us all to say, yeah, you may have been, but now just take a step back and ask yourself who's been included in that.
Right. Absolutely.
Yes,
And,
that
and
we all go ahead.
if
Yes.
if anybody wants to email me before I
Oh,
forget, they can find me at jpowell at MSM, Morehouse School of Medicine, msm.edu.
yes. And we'll have
Yeah.
the information in the show notes.
Okay,
That
perfect.
that will be wonderful. Excellent. So we will do that. Again, thank you. And I want to say thank you to everyone who stopped by. Please leave a comment, share this episode, and thank you again for
Thank
listening to Rooted to Thrive.